Hi, my name's Galea and this is Jackie Cranney. Jackie and I are both members of the Celebs Community of Practice, and I'm here today to ask Jackie a few questions about her work. So Jackie, the first question I have for you is, could you please explain to me the difference between scholarly teaching and SOTL, which is an acronym for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning?
Certainly. There has been some research around this area, and scholarly teaching is what we all should be doing as educators, and that is to continuous improvement of how we deliver our learning and teaching and assessment strategies for our students in order to maximise the possibility that they will gain the intended learning outcomes. So it's kind of like an intervention or program or treatment that we do as educators in our practice, and then assessing or evaluating whether or not that is effective, and engaging in looking at feedback and evaluation from peers or students, and continuously then responding to that feedback and the behavioural outcomes, of course, and trying new things and see what happens in the next iteration. So that's scholarly teaching, and of course really high-level scholarly teaching would be looking at the literature as well. What SOTL is where you actually plan ahead of time in a theory-based way and think, okay, well, I want this kind of effect in my program. I want to institute an educational innovation based on the research and the theory that's out there, and I'm going to go to the trouble of evaluating it appropriately with appropriate SOTL methods, and then I am going to report that back to the community at large. In other words, to actually publish the work that you're doing within your classroom, to test theories, to try to improve the outcomes, or even doing correlation on survey research, just to inform what the nature of the educational experience is and how to actually improve that. So the difference really is that with SOTL, you put yourself out there in terms of planning and then reporting on your interventions.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. I think it's a really important nuance to understand and appreciate. So why do we need gold standards for SOTL?
I think the main challenge for us as academics, when we come from many different disciplines, we're not trained in undertaking educational research, unless of course you're in the School of Education. And so it's sometimes hard for us to get from our mindset of being a psychologist or a geneticist or a physicist or whatever, to being in the mindset of undertaking research that's relevant to our students. And so I think the gold standards are there to help us, and in particular, if we're undertaking research, then we want to undertake quality research that's worthwhile, that's publishable, that has an impact. And so that's what the gold standard idea is about. And we have to acknowledge that this is applied research, and applied research in the context of the classroom or wherever that is, virtual or face-to-face, is extremely challenging. So any applied research is usually challenging in the sense that there are many practical considerations and constraints. You can't always randomly assign your participant, your student, to particular conditions, and also that there are huge ethical considerations as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what are the proposed gold standards, and can you comment on those in relation to your own research, please?
Sure, I'll do my best. In terms of, there's the first standard is theory-based, and so that acknowledges quite often people have great ideas in their classroom, but they're not in contact with the actual research and the theory that's relevant to what they're thinking they will do. So if you're thinking about SOTL, just as with any other research, you need to know what's come before and what's current. So if you want to make an impact in that regard, then you need to go to the effort of actually engaging with the literature, finding out what's there. In terms of my own research, in terms of the testing effect, whereby it's been shown that the more the student tests themselves, or the educator provides opportunities for that, the greater the outcome in terms of the final exam results, etc. This is obviously driven by a lot of research in memory and cognition, but there's there's a challenge of doing things in the laboratory versus a kind of analogue situation versus actually in the classroom, and that's where some of my work with the testing effect has been most impactful, in the sense that I've kind of gone across all of those domains of research, but of course the most challenging is when you actually do it in the classroom, but it's also the most meaningful, of course, because you're then influencing practice.
Okay.
So theory-based is obviously important. Another one is longitudinal design. So this is in contrast to a cross-sectional. Really, it depends on what you're doing. So for example, if you're looking at aspects of student motivation or personality or something like that, and looking at that in terms of the way they might be performing in a group or team situation, then maybe cross-sectional is okay. So it really depends on the research question that you have. But if you are actually engaging in educational innovation, then of course it has to be, in some sense, long-term, to really say, well, I did this particular teaching strategy at this time, and before that the students were in this state, but after that they were in that state. So you at least need to possibly look at pre-post factors. So that's what longitudinal is. But again, depends on the actual research question that you have.
Sure.
True experimental design, this is where you randomly assign students to particular conditions. This is really, really challenging, but not impossible. Depends again on your research question. But in my research, the closest we've come to that is with the testing effect research, where we have a lot of classes in first year psychology, and so we at least attempted across the different conditions that we had in our research to, so it was not an individual student assignment, but kind of a semi-random class assignment, so that we had across the conditions just as many early morning ones as late afternoon ones. So it's kind of semi-random, but not totally random. So that's the closest I've come to it. Other researchers have been able to do this quite successfully, depending again on the research question that they're looking at, by, for example, randomly assigning students to something that's happening on the learning management system. Large sample sizes, we know that's preferable, not always possible, but you can always start with a pilot that might, build up to a bigger sample. Diverse samples, that's really challenging, so across different institutions. It is possible if you're looking at, say, student attitudes or educator attitudes, but almost impossible, I'd say, in terms of a particular intervention, because you have to have a lot of people agreeing to do the same thing at different institutions. So advanced statistical techniques are always advisable. High standards of ethics. We're very lucky, I think, that we have very high standard ethics in terms of the committees that we have here at UNSW, so I don't think that's a problem here at UNSW. And finally, the last standard here is mixed method approach, so using both qualitative and quantitative data, and I think that in educational research that's always advisable. So there's advantages and disadvantages to both of those forms of data, and so if you're able to fold in both kinds in your study, then I think you'll get the most out of it, the most understanding. So with our research, we have mostly focused on quantitative. We haven't done a lot of qualitative analysis because that isn't my strength, but we have always found that by having the student voice in it, or allowing the student voice in my research, then that does inform us about how to interpret some aspects of the quantitative outcomes.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jackie. That's really interesting and helpful as well. I believe you've also conducted some research into motivation. I was wondering if you could talk about that and how it relates to the gold standards as well.
Okay, so most of my research with motivation has been with my higher degree students and honours students, and I guess the theoretical framework that we've utilised for the most part has been self-determination theory, and this is very well supported theory that's relevant to educational contexts, and it guides a lot of our curricular work for the last 5 years or so. So when we're actually designing and delivering the curriculum, we do consider aspects of, say, autonomous motivation and the psychological needs of autonomy, competence and relatedness when we are designing the curricula. So right now we're looking at some of our courses in terms of that and comparing the outcomes of particularly those psychological needs and well-being, also looking at performance when we can, but there's always ethical issues about that, in terms of, say, some of the courses that were specifically designed around evidence-based self-management strategies. And then we're also looking at a sample who are outside of that course and looking at the same outcomes. Okay. And so for the comparison of those two groups, are obviously not randomly assigned. There's possibly the number is a little bit small in the actual course who are responding to this research currently, but the numbers are high in the other course. But in any case, not totally random assignment, but nevertheless theory-based and reasonable in numbers enough that we think that we'll be able to compare those outcomes of our strategies, our learning and teaching and assessment strategies across those two groups of students. So that's where that's going. We've also undertaken in the past some research on self-determination theory around and goal setting, and in particular we have shown that the SMART goal strategy, which is talked a lot about in the business world, but also to a certain extent in the educational world, very little empirical. So we haven't found any straightforward research that supports the SMART goal strategy. So we designed a study around that. It wasn't in the classroom, it was within the lab, but nevertheless we found that with our first year psychology students who employed the SMART goal strategy, they rated their goal attainment, including academic tasks that they were doing, much higher than the comparison group who didn't employ the SMART goal strategies.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, how does this all relate to the rubber brain? Okay,
the rubber brain we originally drafted as a textbook for our psychological science of self-management and wellbeing courses, but then we realised that we actually wanted the students to take this book and use it in their everyday life, and so we took another year to rewrite it in a more accessible form, because we're academic writers and we're not used to that kind of communication that's a little bit more accessible. But anyway, so we produced the rubber brain. We're using it as a textbook in our courses, and I guess the link is that we want to be able to share our research, whether it's directly in the classroom or outside of, but relevant to students. And so within that book we discuss some of these evidence-based strategies that we've been working on, including the testing effect, as well as things like the SMART goal strategy.
Great. Well, look, thank you so much for your time today,
Thank you.
Jackie. It's been very stimulating, and I'm sure it has been for our audience as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.